Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this PointBeyond webinar on SharePoint strategy. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. We are going to be recording this webinar and we will be sending a link out to it afterwards. Also, on the right-hand side of your screens, you should see a questions panel. Please do feel free to post questions at any time, and we'll either tackle those as we go or we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So this afternoon's webinar is on SharePoint strategy. We're going to just introduce ourselves now. My name is Ian Woodgate. I'm the Managing Director of PointBeyond Limited, and I'm joined by my colleague, John Bukowski. So John, if we can have the next slide, please. So the agenda is we're going to say a little bit about ourselves. We're then going to talk about some of the common problems that we see when people are attempting to deploy and make best use of SharePoint. And then we're going to take a look at how we go about helping organizations to define a SharePoint strategy and sharing some of our tips and tricks for doing that, and how we often see some common issues with SharePoint and some of our approaches to overcome those. And then, as I've already mentioned, we'll have a Q&A session at the end, although we may also take questions as we go. So as I've already mentioned, my name is Ian Woodgate. I'm the person on the left here. I've been working with SharePoint for far too many years, probably since about 2001. I speak quite a lot at SharePoint events, spoke at the Global SharePoint Conference last year, and I also run the SharePoint UK user group for the south coast of England. My background is in financial services, and I have a very technical background. These days I tend to get more involved on the high level and the SharePoint strategy type engagements. And I'm joined by our Head of Consulting, John.
Yes, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you to everybody who's attending this both live and listening to the pre-recorded session. As Ian mentioned, I'm John Bukowski. My job, I don't know why that always does that, sorry about that. My job at PointBeyond is to make sure that we have happy and satisfied customers, and that I'm also responsible for putting in place the processes and controls to make that happen. I have been delivering SharePoint projects for over 5 years now. I've also been a SharePoint power user since probably back in the SharePoint 2003 days. My background is originally in software development. I've constructed many large-scale custom web apps, and I've come up through the ranks, probably wearing virtually every hat that you can wear in the software development area. But I've been in management and out of professional development for quite a while now. So here I am, and that's me. I think let's move on and talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is SharePoint strategy. What I'd like to do first is just have an introductory slide about what we're talking about when we mean strategy. This definition is taken from Wikipedia, and it says that strategy is a high-level plan to achieve one or more goals under conditions of uncertainty. Strategy has many definitions, but generally involves setting goals, determining actions to achieve those goals, and mobilizing resources to execute the actions. So I'm not going to read the rest of it, but basically strategy is about planning and having an idea about where you're trying to get to and how you're going to get there at the highest of levels.
I think that's very good, John. Something I'd add to that really complements that is I think an important aspect of strategy is actually about making the right decisions as well. So especially if you take something like SharePoint, you've got some fairly fundamental decisions to make about how you're going to use it. Is it going to be on-premise? Is it going to be in the cloud? What version are we going to use? Are we going to upgrade? What content are we going to store in it? And those are really fundamental kind of decisions that you have to make up front, and I think that those are an important aspect of strategy.
Agreed, yes. And so some of the discussions, when we initially discuss strategy with our clients and our prospects, they can go one of two ways. Often with our clients, or usually prospective clients who aren't familiar with SharePoint, or maybe just had SharePoint installed for a very short time and using it in very limited capacities, in very limited ways, but not in any sort of enterprise capacity. This is often the type of conversation that we get. We get asked, what can SharePoint do for us? And our first question is, well, what do you need SharePoint to do? And this goes back to the previous slide and saying that you always achieve better. Our point of view is you always achieve better results if you have some sort of plan in place rather than feeling your way around blindly in the dark.
Absolutely, and I think what I'd add on to that as well is that SharePoint is not a silver bullet, and I think sometimes people do come to us with that kind of expectation that SharePoint will somehow kind of solve all of their problems, when of course it's a suite of tools for delivering solutions, but it's not a magic silver bullet that will solve all their problems in its own right.
Yes, absolutely, and that mindset tends to come into play as well. You generally see the results of that mindset when we're speaking to people who have had SharePoint in use for some time and don't feel that they're getting the results out of it they feel like they should be getting. There's a usual familiar number of symptoms that users report, such as the site structure is a complete mess, and it's difficult to browse to find anything. The content's out of date and nothing's relevant. Users can't browse and search for information. Search results often come up inaccurate, or the search results aren't relevant to what they've typed into the search box. They're not quite sure of what the features are. Or another common one is that it doesn't work like a lot of other web properties out that they're familiar with. It's not as user-friendly as something like Dropbox, Google Docs. It doesn't have all the social features of Facebook, etc. And then the results that we have some listed on the right-hand side of the slide, are also quite typical, but they generally result in the negative impressions that the symptoms generate, and it turns SharePoint into a problem rather than a solution.
And I think, very much as you've got here, John, we often see SharePoint being blamed for the problems, when in fact the problem was never really with SharePoint. It's just that there's been no clarity about how to actually use it. I think a couple of extra things that I would add in here that I've seen on some of the engagements that I've been on is SharePoint's perhaps been badly installed or badly maintained, and it's actually unreliable as well. So users are trying to do things and they're getting error messages, or things are failing or taking too long, and that obviously leads to a sense of frustration. And the other thing I see quite often is people are given SharePoint, but they're really given no guidance on how to actually use it. And a scenario I've seen a couple of times now is people are given SharePoint, but they've still got their personal files, and they've still got their shared drives as well, and they're not quite sure where they should be saving their documents. So what do they end up doing? They end up saving their document in SharePoint and saving it in their on their file shares, and then maybe they've got a My Site, so they save it there as well. And I've seen those kind of things as well, where the lack of guidance means people are not quite sure how they're supposed to be using it, so they carry on using their old tools and their file shares, but they also start using SharePoint as well, and you end up with this kind of proliferation of copies of documents and content. So yes, absolutely, guidance on how to use is critical.
Right, absolutely. And a lot of these are just sheer signs of the lack of a well-thought strategy when applying SharePoint to business problems. So that's what we're here today to try to try to help put some of the thought into making SharePoint deployments and SharePoint-based solutions successful.
So, and I think a fundamental aspect of this is SharePoint is very different to, say, deploying something like Exchange, where the proposition of what it does is very clear. Exchange delivers email and calendar type functionality, and everyone's very happy with that. You don't have to have a lot of planning meetings about how you're going to use Exchange. And SharePoint is fundamentally different to solutions like that, and I think people don't fully appreciate that sometimes when they embark upon SharePoint deployments or upgrades.
Exactly, and I think one of the key reasons for that is because unlike Exchange, which delivers a very limited and narrow set of services and does it in a fairly well-defined way, SharePoint is a platform, much like ASP.NET is a platform, where you can do a number of things with it. It has a bit of plumbing built in that allows certain things to be made easier, but it in and of itself doesn't really provide an ideal solution. And that is the point of this slide, is that SharePoint just sitting on its own, installed and without any configuration, adds very little value to a business. And you really need to think about what sorts of business problems you're trying to solve and how you're going to apply SharePoint to get value out of your investment and to get solutions to those problems. If you don't do that, then you can end up with any of the common symptoms that we often come across. So again, planning. And how can you get around some of those hurdles and get over some of those hurdles, get over some of those roadblocks? Well, we have potentially the answer that you wouldn't expect coming from a company that advises on SharePoint solutions, but I would say don't do SharePoint projects. What we recommend instead is do business change projects that leverage SharePoint as your platform for delivery. And that simply means don't expect SharePoint, don't expect SharePoint, as Ian said before, to be a silver bullet that's going to solve all your problems, especially if you've not put any forethought into it. Take the time, make the investment to do the upfront planning, to figure out what it is you need to solve, and apply SharePoint to try to fix it.
Absolutely. So in a nutshell, what we're saying here is that the focus always should be on delivering business solutions and business benefits to your organization. The fact that we've happened to use SharePoint as the tool or the vehicle for doing that is almost coincidental. It's certainly not of a huge amount of relevance to your business users, because they don't care, right? They just want a solution that enables them to do their jobs better. And SharePoint in itself doesn't mean anything to a lot of business users. So the focus, absolutely, as John said, that business change projects, business focus, SharePoint is merely the tool set that you're using to deliver those projects.
Exactly. A lot of the pain around SharePoint projects are caused by things that have very little to do with SharePoint itself. Most of the content on this slide was taken from a white paper that is a very good read. Leading Change: Why Transformations Efforts Fail. If you notice the publication date, it's from 1995, well before the days of SharePoint. But if you look at some of the things that, some of the key points that we pulled out of the paper, I'm sure that those of you who have struggled with SharePoint will see some familiar trends in here, some familiar things that you've worked with. So I think it definitely holds true over almost after nearly 20 years of publication. And these are some of the things that you definitely want to think about when you're approaching SharePoint. Most of these, as I said, have nothing to do with SharePoint. It's all about the preparation and figuring out what you want to do, what you want to achieve, and getting everybody aligned to that vision.
And I look at this list, and it's amazing, isn't it? This was written in 1995. You just think this is so much a SharePoint, so much reflects accurately on a SharePoint project. It's quite impressive, really.
Yeah, I have seen this applied. Hands up, I've seen this applied at a few SharePoint conferences talking about specifically why SharePoint projects fail. But so it's not, but it does hold true. And how do you get around? So you might be wondering how you get around that.
I think that before you go on to that, John, there's just a couple of extra points that I'd like to make on that. I think
Sure.
One thing that I see on a lot of projects is SharePoint projects are IT-led. And as in of itself, that's not a bad thing, as long as the business is still engaged and clear about what the business objectives of the project are. The other challenge that I see quite often is people treat SharePoint as a one-off shrink wrap. We're going to do SharePoint, and very early in the project they say, what's it going to cost? And you need to invest some time thinking carefully about how you're going to use SharePoint before you can answer that question, because you've got choices and you've got options.
Yeah, I often use the building a house analogy, which admittedly is very tired, and I get frowny faces whenever I bring that up, but it's very true. The same thing holds with technology, especially SharePoint. And that if you're going to have somebody build a house for you, you can't just say, I have a budget of 50,000 pounds. What kind of house can when is my house going to be done, and what are you going to give me? There's a lot more there's a lot more information that needs to be discussed before the builder can go down the road of building that house. You might have a large family, so you need extra bedrooms. You might have parents living with you that you might need special access ramps or something, or any number of special needs. And just like how basic housing requirements, business requirements are different. No two businesses are the same. No two businesses, even businesses in the same sector, have slightly different types of problems. So it does require the upfront thought, and it's very difficult to apply a one-size-fits-all solution to businesses where one size really doesn't fit all.
Yeah, and the requirements can be very diverse with a product like SharePoint as well. Okay.
So now we're on to how we see getting around these problems. And this is more of a an attempt around trying to define what we mean when we say business change. So business change, as we say, isn't just slapping the SharePoint DVD into a server and hitting install and watching it run. It's thinking about all the things that you want it to achieve. And this four-step process outlines the types of forethought that needs to go in, that we recommend that goes into a successful SharePoint deployment even before you press the go button. And we'll talk about each one of these in some of the later slides, but just as a highlight, you need to really understand the business objectives, and what we mean here is what are your business problems, what are the key things that are holding your organization back, or your department back, or your team back from achieving the targets that your board or your management or your superiors have set for you. Understanding all of the impacts of those solutions as well. What users, what users are impacted? Who's going to need to learn the new solution? Who else is going to need to get information from the new solution? What does, what are the end goals and what are we trying to achieve? What is happening now versus what the future looks like? Articulating the desired outcomes is about determining whether or not you're succeeding. It's often not simple to determine if a solution is succeeding or not without taking some measurements. Those measurements can be qualitative, such as surveys to find out how users perceive the old system versus working with the old system versus working with the new system. Or they could be quantitative, where you're counting the number of times the search facility is accessed, for example, or anything that can be countable, counting the amount of email storage that's required if you're trying to share documents on SharePoint versus emailing them online, emailing through email. And then creating a sensible roadmap where you're trying to deliver your solutions in a sensible manner that helps you to build momentum and gain the user uptake.
So John, just a quick question on that, which I think might be worth clarifying, is what level of technical decisions would you expect and technical input would you expect to have when you're developing the solution vision? Are you thinking about SharePoint features at that point?
I think you're having SharePoint features in mind at that point, but you're not trying to solutionize necessarily. I have, as a bullet point in the first step, which is defining business objectives, is brainstorming potential solutions. So I think you're always going to need to keep in mind the budget that you're working with, the time scales you're working with, and what's achievable in those time scales, with those constraints, either through SharePoint features or augmenting those features with any sort of customizations. But you're not. Most of this is quite technology agnostic, in that you're not really developing your solutions until a further state down the road. So this, I guess we would call this the envisioning phase, or the discovery phase of a project, which is where you're trying to understand.
So you're making strategic choices, but you're not going down to the level of doing the full solution design.
No, you won't end up with this with a full spec in most situations. But I think you would have to consider what your solution options were, because that will inform your roadmap.
Right.
Possible. And that could impact any number of these as well. How what items in your proposed solution would help you to take measurements? What items, what potential solutions would have the least and greatest impact on the stakeholders that are going to be involved? That sort of thing. So, it depends is the usual consultative answer that no one likes to hear. But yes, you would need to have a small idea of how you might be delivering at a high level.
Okay.
Again, because it's strategic, it's very high level.
Okay. Sounds good.
So what is involved in each one of these boxes then? A lot of times we go into we'll pick up documentation for RFPs that might come in, and we'll see rather than business problems that the customers are trying to solve, they're asking for lists of features to be implemented. A common one that we see a lot with the steady stream of upgrades to 2013 that we see is that we want to take advantage of some of the features that aren't in our current installation, such as management.
The bells and whistles argument, right?
Yes, exactly. The usual laundry list of everything that they don't have now that they think they might want, but they don't have it's unclear whether or not they have a real problem they're trying to address with that. So we usually ask why, we use the word why a lot, or ask a lot of questions to try to figure out why do you think you need managed metadata. And it's not our recommended approach to setting off on the right foot for your SharePoint journey, because how do you know what benefits you're going to get out of a particular feature unless you have a particular problem that you're trying to solve with it?
Absolutely. And John, I'll add on this slide as well something that I see from time to time, which always sets alarm bells ringing, is when we're speaking to an organization and we're at the start of a potential project and we're talking about requirements, is a fixation and an initial focus on what it looks like. And don't get me wrong, that's important to start thinking about the branding and the design and the colors and the layouts and the logos, but it's the icing on the cake. It shouldn't be the starting point, because it's not delivering functionality and business benefit. I don't know if you have further thoughts on that, John.
No, I think the branding can be very important when you're talking about things like user adoption, because users, there's arguments to and from that as well, because you obviously don't brand your Microsoft Office. At least I've never seen Microsoft Office or Microsoft Exchange branded. You just use Word and you use Excel, and they all look like Excel looks like on every other business user's desktop without custom branding. So there's an argument for not branding these tools. But in something like again, it depends. If you have if you're using SharePoint as a corporate intranet where you're sharing information with users throughout your organization, or even with allowing exchange of information or collaboration with users outside your organization, a professional appearance can help with user uptake and engagement. And there's a lot of intangibles that it can help, but it's not, as you said, it's not.
It shouldn't be a starting point. It's effectively a decision that needs to be made, but it's not delivering any real business value or business benefit at the outset. And starting and getting too focused on how it looks at the outset of a project, in my experience, tends to not be a good thing.
Yeah, and just a final thought on this, going back to the home building analogy, I often liken chasing features without any understanding of how they're going to be used in your business. It's like building an extension for your house without any forethought into which part of your house you're going to attach it to and how it's going to seamlessly integrate with the rest of your house. You need to have that whole view before you can proceed. If you really want to strengthen your chances of winning.
Absolutely.
So here's some examples that we've come up with for what we would consider good high-level business objectives and good places to start the discussions about SharePoint. And you'll notice very few, if any, of these have anything to do with SharePoint features, but it talks about pain. I'm not going to read through all of these, but they something like time required to complete a key business process is impacting our profitability, and we might have some metrics to back that up, or we just feel that this process can be sped up because it's taking too long for other businesses in our sector doing it much faster than we do. Those are great ways to start conversations about how to use features of SharePoint to try to reduce some of that pain and gain some, make a tangible impact.
Absolutely.
And so that's the business objectives. Objectives and what we call the solution vision are inherently connected, because the objective forms part of the triangle of what we call the vision. So it's the business problem that you're trying to solve. There are other components to consider as well that we've spoken of some that we've hinted at in other slides. It's considering who are your users that are involved and the stakeholders that are going to be receiving benefits. The difference being end users might be the day-to-day users of a particular system, and the stakeholders might be receiving reports from the system and consuming information that's produced from system outputs. And then the outcomes, what you're trying to achieve from both a qualitative and quantitative perspective. These all encapsulate the vision. This is really where ideally we would start every SharePoint implementation, is knowing what the true vision is for a solution. And you can have many of these because SharePoint is a platform, and because you can build any number of solutions in a fairly short amount of time on SharePoint if you keep it out of the box. You would expect to have, you know, maybe a half a dozen of these on even a smaller solution to dozens on a larger solution. And that also allows us to break the implementation up into manageable pieces as well.
Absolutely, and as I know you're going to talk about in a minute, John, as well, it's very helpful when it comes to starting to prioritize what you're going to deliver with SharePoint.
Exactly. And speaking of priorities, when we talk about roadmaps, we found that having a reasonable roadmap, a sensible roadmap, as we said earlier, and I have the label wrong on this slide. We should be creating a sensible roadmap. Sensible in this respect means rolling things out a little bit at a time, and this really, well, it helps to ease your burden in several different areas. First is around user adoption. Well, first of all, the obvious first one is around the ease in, we're being selfish here, the ease it is in rolling it out. It's a lot easier to roll out a solution gradually than all at once on the project team that's involved in it. But it also has a great impact on user uptake because just as the project team might be a bit overwhelmed in rolling out a large amount of functionality all in one go at one time, your users are going to be overwhelmed at all because they're getting a huge amount of change dropped upon them at one time that they have to figure out how to deal with and how it's going to impact the way that they work. If you introduce change gradually, a little bit at a time, and again, this comes into governance and user adoption, you start with some quick wins, especially, you can earn your users' trust that you know what you're doing in rolling out this new solution platform, new solutions using this new platform.
And John, just to mention as well, I hope it's kind of obvious, and I'm sure it is to everyone watching, we aren't for 1 second suggesting that you should always do company pages and my sites in phase 1 and department pages and search in phase 2. This is very much just as an example. The exact phasing and the exact projects that you're going to consider within each phase obviously is determined by the roadmap.
Absolutely, it's quite hypothetical. But again, you want to identify and discuss what your quick wins are. And for a lot of companies, for a lot of organizations, just having a simple one-page company news intranet is the way to introduce users to SharePoint. Might be the way to go if they have a need for the corporate communications. It might not be.
Absolutely, we really like quick wins. We really like getting something of value out there to the business and delivering some benefit quickly. It's a great way to drive more buy into the project and the delivery of SharePoint as a whole.
And then, as discussed in the previous slide, this just highlights a bit of some of the challenges around delivering everything in a big bang approach rather than spacing things out and creating a roadmap. There are oftentimes needs to deliver a lot of things at once. Legal compliance being the first thing that pops into my mind, but I've also seen more personal impacts, such as trying to meet a particular objective that you've signed up to, or potential cost savings in trying to get rid of licenses quickly. So trying to roll out systems, replacement systems, without having to renew existing licenses for some amount of time. But again, we recommend proceeding with caution on those because of the overwhelm that it can create in your organization from introducing too much change at once.
Absolutely, SharePoint changes at a fairly fundamental way, the way people work and the way they interact with particularly documents and the way that they collaborate. And that ultimately is a cultural change, of course, and it takes time, and you need to manage that degree of change.
Exactly. We haven't spoken much about, we mentioned, but we haven't spoken much about governance and user adoption, but those two elements are also quite important to achieving successful rollouts. But like a lot of these other topics, they're topics that are worthy of their own separate webinars. So just suffice it to say, because you don't have dedicated slides for that subject matter, not like we're giving it short shrift here, definitely recommending that you don't discount governance and user adoption when you're rolling out SharePoint. Users need to know what changes are coming. They need to understand why the changes are being rolled out, how it's going to impact them, hopefully in a positive sense.
Absolutely.
But how do you know what defines a sensible roadmap, or how to create that sensible roadmap? And there's several reasons. You can go on gut feel. Some of the times it's obvious. We've used...
I thought it's who shouts the loudest, isn't it, John?
Inevitably, that's sometimes the way it goes. But this is actually a good tool to combat the person who's shouting the loudest, especially if what they're shouting isn't in line with what you're trying to, isn't in line with the objectives that you're trying to set and trying to get a sensible rollout plan. So one of the tools that we use when we do strategy engagements is to try to understand the potential solutions and different aspects of those solutions, so that we line them up in such a way that we're delivering the quick wins that have the highest positive business impact first, and staggering out more complex solutions to a later time once you've already gained some momentum with your business change processes. Not going to go through how there's a series of Excel spreadsheets that we use behind getting at this, but basically at a high level we look at aspects of the solution. Ian, this goes back to your question from a few slides ago about, are we considering technical solutions when we're going through the process? Inevitably, to produce your roadmap, you have to think about the solutions, the technical ways that you can potentially solve the business problems that you're finding that your customer has. So once you've arrived at a few candidate solutions, this is a way to quickly determine what's going to make sense to deliver in a particular order, and this may help you to either consider or completely rule out solutions full stop. And we do that by just we have a worksheet called a project one-pager, where we define aspects about a particular piece of the SharePoint solution, and then we assess it based upon a few different factors. Complexity involves any business processes that we're trying to automate, and the complexity of those processes, the look and feel elements of the solution. Does it require a extensively complex user interface, and does it have a high degree of user interactivity involved? Are the disaster recovery and uptime and throughput requirements, which we generally term robustness, are those heavily emphasized? Is there a high need for those? And then we also look at reach, which is how far the application stretches in terms of number of users that would be using the solution, amount of data that it's going to be sitting on top of and manipulating, number of systems that it needs to get data from or put data to, and also the business value, which is the impact on the business in across a few different varieties, either direct impact to the top or bottom line, or enabling core competency, the growth of a core competency or new competency. And we take all that information and we throw it onto a chart similar to what you see here. And for this very made-up example, you can see that we've got the lower left-hand quadrant. We're kind of calling this the sweet spot, which is exactly where you want to be with your initial SharePoint projects that you roll out. These two projects have relatively low reach, so they're probably department or team-oriented projects versus enterprise-level projects. And the complexity is quite low relative to everything else that we're trying to solve. So it could be something like a very simple expense claim workflow, or a holiday booking workflow, or something like that. And then these other solutions, I think we were having a discussion, Ian, weren't we, yesterday, about how you would progress around these quadrants.
Yeah.
So
and there's a trade-off ultimately, isn't there? Because you're trading off complexity and reach against value as well. If you've got something that's very high value but is very complex, then is or is that not a higher priority than something that's the other way around?
Exactly. But I think my answer to this ultimately is that you shouldn't make decisions ultimately based upon something like this. But this helps to visualize the information that you've collected and help you make informed decisions on where you should go. So there might be a business reason why you go for this solution first, because maybe it involves a significant cost savings that are capitalizing on an opportunity that's available for a limited basis. But unless you have
or maybe even a regulatory requirement that's mandating it.
Exactly.
So you have to, this is a useful tool, isn't it, John? But there needs to be some. It's not the be all and the end all. It's a useful input to making the decisions about your roadmap.
It's guidance, but it really helps to cut through the typical workshop discussions when you don't have any tangible evidence to fall back on. So it helps to shortcut a lot of decisions.
Certainly when I've done this exercise on recent engagements, it's been quite interesting to see that some of the projects that end up scoring very highly aren't the ones that the organisation was necessarily thinking about doing. And then when you present them with evidence, then it's quite interesting to see how people react and like, oh, well, actually, yeah, that's really, we hadn't thought about that. It's a really good point. Maybe we will do it that way around. So it's a very useful exercise.
And then in conjunction with your roadmap and the phased approach is making sure that as you're rolling things out, making sure that you're measuring the results of your efforts as well. So as you roll a particular solution out or suite of solutions, make sure that you're measuring them to figure out if they're working. If you put them out there and you don't know if, how users are taking to them, you've got no chance of improving them, turning what could be a moderate success into a booming success, and this ultimately impacts your ability to get funding or get clearance for future projects. This is especially critical in the early stages to make sure that the solutions that you are putting out on SharePoint are achieving the desired objectives and are delivering on the desired benefits. So this is just basically saying, after you deploy it, measure it and make sure it's working and improve the areas that still need to be improved. Celebrate your successes, not only at the pub, but making sure that you publicize out to users who might not be using SharePoint-based solutions as of yet in your organizations as to how SharePoint is making a difference in your organization and how that's happening. And then that will enable you to continue to expand. And this is very much a phased, iterative approach that fits very well with our agile processes and our agile way of thinking.
And this, touching on the celebrate as well, John, there's nothing better to kind of sell your approach and your solutions into other business units than to have one business unit who's raving about how happy they are about the solution that they've got. So the whole thing can kind of snowball.
Exactly. So, starting to wrap up here, this looks very similar to an earlier slide that talked about some of the reasons why SharePoint projects don't succeed. But turning each one on its head, if you follow, hopefully, if you follow the advice on this slide, you'll have a much greater chance of succeeding with your SharePoint projects. And again, to emphasize, 7 of the 8 blocks have nothing to do with SharePoint and everything to do with the upfront planning and practicality that goes into determining your SharePoint strategy. And Ian, did you have anything else to say before we're on to your final thought?
No, I mean, I think this is very nice, and this is certainly the inputs and the things you need to consider. What ultimately you're looking to get out of that planning is really your roadmap and your clarity as to what you're going to deliver, what order you're going to deliver it in, and how you're going to deliver it.
Yep. And then after this comes the fun of actually building it, but the benefits of actually having gone through the extra efforts of this type of exercise is that your solution, your delivery team will have a much better idea of what they're delivering. They should be able to hit closer to the mark without dropping something in that users don't know what they're getting and are not expecting and doesn't come anywhere close to what they're asking for, because you're giving them a better idea. You're giving your implementation team a much better idea up front of the business problems that you're trying to solve and the results that you're trying to achieve.
It all ties back to business objectives at the end of the day and delivering against those clear business objectives.
Yep. Final thought, time for one final thought on strategy?
Absolutely. So this is a quote that I wrote on a blog post, I think, several years ago. It seems to have got fairly widely used and distributed. And all I'm really trying to say here is that we consistently find that thought and a little upfront planning about how you're going to use SharePoint, it gives remarkably better outcomes and remarkably higher probability of success with whatever you choose to do with SharePoint. And so just thinking and planning and having proper business alignment and having clear way to assess projects and a clear roadmap, define what you're delivering, how you're delivering it, who to and why, the impact of that in terms of where your SharePoint project goes and how your organization perceives and uses SharePoint can be considerable. So I think that's our final slide, John, is that right?
It is. And before we get to questions, I just want to say thanks everybody for attending today so far, and feel free if you haven't posted any questions yet. Hopefully the information that we will generate.
Sorry, John, I was saying we do have some questions.
Great. But this isn't the most. This isn't our usual technical webinar. I appreciate that. Where we have a lot of clever demos, and we'll be getting back to those. I think we're scheduled for another one of those next month. Is that right? But this is hopefully today at least one of the objectives that we've achieved is just to talk to enlighten our SharePoint user community in terms of some of the things that you really should be thinking about when you start to approach either a greenfield SharePoint solution or how to expand your existing SharePoint deployment.
Okay.
That.
So thank you very much, John. And as John said, thank you to everyone for attending. We're going to move on to some questions now. So the first question, John, is you talked a bit about quick wins. What are some common quick wins that you see with SharePoint? I'll tell you what, should we choose one each?
Sure.
You can go first.
Sure. Thank you for that. So one of the benefits one of the areas that we see a lot of quick wins coming out of is just the out-of-the-box team collaboration sites. Because even though it probably take the smallest amount of planning to do, and without planning they can be you can have their problems, but they're probably the least one of the lower risk things that you can roll out that deliver the quickest benefit for the buck, because it allows the out-of-the-box tools allow for sharing and collaboration of documents, multiple users editing the same documents, and discussion boards and that sort of thing. So I think that the collaboration sites would be somewhere I'd look at for an initial quick win.
Okay. The one I'm going to choose is I see often a quick win around automating one or more simple business processes. So perhaps doing something with a simple form and some fairly simple workflow to take a business process that perhaps is manual or inefficient and delivering a solution using SharePoint and hopefully a no-code approach to delivering that solution. I particularly like that as a potential quick win because sometimes it can deliver a real quantifiable benefit in terms of a time or a cost saving. But those are two examples that we see often, but I think the quick win for your organization may depend on, it obviously ultimately depends on what your challenges are. For one organization I worked with a couple of years back, the challenge was actually to display information about visitors on their homepage and to be able to distribute that information widely within their organization. So they were actually a museum, so they wanted to know who was going, how many people were attending, and what exhibitions were they going to. And so to suddenly have that information available centrally that everyone could see it was a massive quick win. So it very much depends what your requirements are, but I think collaboration and workflow are two common areas that we see. Okay, another question, John, is this looks good, but how practically would PointBeyond help us with delivering a SharePoint strategy? I'm paraphrasing the question slightly.
Right. Well, practically, I think we'd come in and sit down and have a discussion with the key business stakeholders if they were available, and just ask how things work currently. If you are a SharePoint customer currently, what works and what doesn't, and what have you been trying to achieve with it that you don't you're not currently getting the benefits from, and we go from there.
And the follow-up question just posted, which is how long does that take, John?
It can vary, but generally we get through most of these these types of efforts in 1 to 2 weeks. It just depends on how the size of the organization, the size of the problems that we're trying to tackle, and the size, the amount. If there's an existing SharePoint installation present, how big, wide, deep, etc. that is, along with any other content that they would consider bringing into SharePoint. So yeah, week or two-ish.
Yeah, and I would say it's an upfront investment that, in my experience, without exception, pays dividends.
Agreed.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions. Is there anything different between how you would deal with on-premise SharePoint versus, sorry, with a, I'm just reading the question, how you would deal with an existing SharePoint site versus a company that didn't have SharePoint?
It's a very good question. Obviously, the company that has SharePoint installed would have been, might be at a different stage or level of maturity, and it would depend on the level of maturity that the company that has SharePoint installed was at. But I think generally we approach it in a very similar fashion. That the analysis of the existing SharePoint system, the ways in which that system is used in the day-to-day business processes would just be an extra added step in our discovery roadmap.
Yeah, it's just another input, really, right, John?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And the last question is, we're receiving different advice on whether or not we should move all of our files into SharePoint. Should we do this or not?
I was just having this conversation earlier today, and
it's a pretty common one, right, for us?
Yeah. Well, we get it a lot. I mean, for businesses who are migrating from an older version of SharePoint to a newer version of SharePoint, almost always there's the element of a file share, a J drive or something like that that's sitting out there where users are storing files either instead of or in addition to SharePoint. And the business has a desire at least to explore the idea of having all of the files in one place. And I think it depends, again, here's that D word again. But some of the factors to consider are how much information, or how much, if you're talking about terabytes and terabytes of data that are on shared drives, how active are those documents, or how relevant are those documents? What percentage of those documents are actively used on a regular basis or would be valuable if they were to be indexed so they're available to turn up and search? If you're moving to Office 365, there's it takes much longer to move a higher volume of files across, just because of the way that you have to move them. You have to use a tool. In that case, it's not possible to use any of the more convenient means that are sometimes available when you're talking about on-premise systems. Ian, I'm sure you can think of a few other factors.
Yeah, it's a very good question. For example, I mean, things that we have to consider will be the technical complexity of migrating that content. Are you going to start tagging it? What's the cost of having that content in SharePoint? Because maybe your SharePoint storage is higher cost than your file share storage. If you've got a policy of moving everything to the cloud, then it makes sense, obviously, that those documents end up in the cloud. But then you always end up with some documents that aren't suited to being, some files that end up that aren't being suited to being stored in SharePoint. So you might have, within the IT department, you might have ISO images and executable files and stuff like that. So where are you going to store those? I think the most important thing is to be clear about how you're going to organize that content if you are going to move it into SharePoint, so that you are clear between what is the legacy content that you've brought across that maybe is there for reference versus the work that's being the documents that are being actively worked on by people within the teams within your organization. But there is no one-size-fits-all answer. Like so much of this stuff, you have to really ascertain what your requirements are, what have you got, what are your cost constraints, what are your time constraints, and what's right for you.
Right. Do we have any more questions come in?
That was the last question, John.
Last one? Okay, great.
So I think it just remains for us to say thank you very much to everyone for attending. If you do have any further questions, please do feel free to get in touch with either John or myself. Yeah, we hope to see you on a future webinar.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for attending, and thank you, Ian.
Thanks, John.